Hello guys, welcome back. This is Adam and this is 8th episode in Azure Fundamentals course. In this episode we will cover the most basic things about resource management in Azure. So what are resources, resource groups and resource manager? Stay tuned! One of the most important things you need to learn when working with Azure are the core building blocks for management of Azure services. And those building blocks consist of resources, resource groups and resource manager. But we will also cover what are the benefits of using those core components when building solutions in Azure. So let me start with resources. When users go to Azure, they purchase services like SQL database, maybe web application hosting, or simply a virtual machine. But it doesn't matter which service they buy, in the end, all those services are represented as a generic object called resource. You can think of resources like an objects that are used to represent your services in Azure. They're basically your contracts representing also a service lifecycle. So as soon as you purchase a service in Azure, you create a resource. As soon as you're done with the service and you delete it, the resource is also deleted. Azure uses resources to save all the configurations that you make for your service. Pretty much any configuration option that you have for your service is represented as a property on that resource. All the resources in Azure can be represented as a JSON template. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a simple file that has properties and values. It's one of the very commonly used standards on the market to describe pretty much any object. Today we don't need to deep dive into specifics of this JSON format, but you should at least know that there are 4 common properties across all resources, like type, API version, name, and location, and some other non-common properties that are different and used to describe different resources, different services within Azure. But no resource in Azure can be created without something called resource group. A resource group is a logical container for all your resources, and it is a requirement in order to create any resource in Azure. So for you, a resource group is a grouping of resources, but you should use it to logically group related resources. It is not a hard requirement, but resource groups were created as a utility to manage Azure resources. Therefore, you should take advantage of them. So how do you know how to group resources together in resource groups? Well, there are many strategies to do so. For instance, there could be a strategy that you would want to apply where you group your related resources by type. In that case, you could have resource groups for your SQL databases and separate resource group for your web applications. The more commonly used strategy is grouping resources by application lifecycle. So having your development resource group spread from your production resource group so that you can apply different scripts, different policies, different security rules, and different access management policies. You can also organize by department name or use resource groups to group resources for billing purposes. For instance, creating a separate resource group for each cost center within your organization. You can also create resource groups by location, which is Azure region. So that way, it's easier for you to manage data sovereignty and security compliance requirements for your organization. But there is no silver bullet here. There's no one policy that will organize resources for every organization on the planet. As such, pretty much any organization uses a combination of those strategies, like combining application names with environment names to give a full separation of the application development lifecycle with their production lifecycle, but also total separation across multiple applications. This is probably one of the most commonly used strategy on the market. Let me now move to Azure Portal so I can create few resources and resource group myself. As I've mentioned previously, you always need a resource group to work with resources in Azure. So let's go and create a resource group first. Go to the menu on the left-hand side, select Resource Groups, and click on the Add button. Once you do it, a form to create a new Azure Resource Group will appear, where the first property that you need to select is a subscription, which simply said is a billing unit for your entire Azure account. In my case, it's a Visual Studio subscription. You also need to provide a resource group name. I will call mine AZ-900. So this will be the resource group that I will use for the remainder of this course. And a region. So where is the metadata about the resource group contained? So this is not relevant to the resources itself. You can have resources in different regions. So I will select North Europe, hit Review and Create. And before anything in Azure is created, you always are shown a validation screen. Think of this like a receipt. It will summarize all the properties and all the options that you selected for a particular resource, in this case, a resource group. And if you are sure you want to create a service, simply hit Create. Creation of the resource group is instantaneous. And resource groups are free, so you can create as many as you need without worrying about charges. Once created, you can navigate to the resource group to review the contents of it. Right now we don't have any resources to display because we didn't create any resource yet. You can either hit Add here to go to the marketplace and create resources, or again use the menu on the left hand side, for instance by going to Storage Accounts. Storage Account is a service used to store files in Azure. To create one, simply hit Add, and as you see there's a form that you need to fill in, and always the mandatory field is subscription and resource group within that subscription. Once you select the resource group, you need to fill in some of the common properties, like for instance storage account name. I will call mine AM Demo Storage 123A. The validation passed, so this name is currently free, and everything else I can leave as default. If I will go Review and Create, again a receipt will be shown on the screen, showing me every property that will be used to create my service. This is important if you're using default property values. If I'm sure, I can simply hit Create. And that's it. This is how easily you can create resources in Azure. Once the resource has been created, you can simply click on Go to the resource to go directly to Azure Service and start managing this. Or you can navigate back to Resource Group to review that this is currently within your resource group. So resource group is a logical container allowing you to manage the resources within it. Additionally, there's an access control panel here, because one of the purposes of resource groups is access control. In this panel, you can add permissions for colleagues. So you can manage permissions for your resources, making sure that your development team has the proper privileges to manage all the resources. And you simply do it by hitting Add Role Assignment, selecting the role, which is simply set a grouping of privileges for managing Azure resources. So you can fine-grain permissions for your development teams. For instance, selecting an owner means everyone can do anything, and then selecting one of the many accounts in your tenant. So you can very easily grant new privileges. For instance, Tom Doe, when I select him, when I click Save, I will be able to find Tom in role assignments. Because Tom is now an owner, just like me, so he can do anything with this resource group and all the resources within it. Additionally, anything you do in Azure Portal, you can also do from command line. For instance, this is Azure CLI, which is a simple command line utility for Azure. You can write AZ login to log into Azure, which will open a browser window asking you to log in. Once you do it, you can go back to your CLI and now start working with Azure in the same manner. And managing Azure resource and resource group from CLI is as easy as in Portal. If I type AZ group create --name AZ-900 2 -- location North Europe, this will create another resource group with name called AZ-900-2. If I type AZ group storage account create --name AM demo storage 123B --resource group, since we need to put that resource inside of the resource group. In this case, it will be AZ-900-2 and -- location, again, North Europe. Once done, a service will be created, but in this case using a command line. And once this process completes, you can navigate to resource group, find your newly created AZ-900-2 resource group, and when you open this, you will find the storage account that we just created. One additional thing that I want to show you is the Resources Azure COM portal. In here, you can review a JSON definition that we're talking about. So if you want to see the common properties for the service that you created, you can find it here. Expand subscriptions, go to the resource groups, AZ-900, open providers, select Microsoft Storage, and in here you will find your storage account that we just created, and all the properties within that storage. One cool trick is that if you don't like this kind of navigation and you don't know how to search for the service that you just created, there's a little trick that you can do. Go back to your resource group, select the storage account, and copy the URL starting from subscriptions on the top. Just copy this part and put it here after Azure Resources.com. When you put it, press enter, it will automatically navigate you to the resource that you're browsing in Azure portal, showing all the common properties for this particular resource. A pretty cool trick. So to summarize, at any point in time, each resource can be in exactly one resource group. Additionally, resource groups have their own location assigned, but this location is only used to store metadata, so it's not impacting resources, because each resource in a resource group can be in a different location. If you are not sure about your strategy, remember that most resources can be moved between the resource groups. Remember also that resource groups cannot be nested, so you cannot create a hierarchy of resource groups. But most importantly, when picking strategy, remember to pick the strategy that fits your organization needs, whenever there's a billing, security, access management, or simply application lifecycle. It is really up to you to decide that what works best for your organization. Which brings me to our last point, which is Resource Manager. As an Azure customer, you can use one of many methods of purchasing services. You can do it through Azure Portal. You can also use it through REST API, so you can create scripts and applications that will automate resource deployments. You can use PowerShell scripting if you want. You can also use CLI like we did in the demo. Or you can simply use one of many programming SDKs if you want. But all of those interfaces connect to the same point, sending the same template. That point is a service called Azure Resource Manager. It's a centralized service governing all the resources in Azure, and it's that service that is responsible for creating each service within Azure. So for you, Resource Manager is a centralized management layer for all the resources and resource groups in Azure. And because it has unified language, unified template language, you always send the same properties, have the same validations, and everything is consistent across multiple interfaces. Resource Manager is also responsible for checking your privileges with Azure Active Directory. This is because Azure Active Directory is a centralized identity and access management service in Azure, so this is where all the privileges are stored. So Azure Resource Manager will check with Azure AD whenever the user that is requesting resource creation, deletion, or changes has a proper privileges assigned. As such, Azure Resource Manager is also responsible for controlling the access and management of the resources. All the demos that we performed today went through Azure Resource Manager in order to create those resource groups and resources. But that's pretty much it. Resource Manager is an internal Azure service for building and managing Azure resources. As with pretty much any episode, materials are attached on episode 8 on my website, so just go there, review the materials attached, check the cheat sheet, and lastly, take the practice test. And that's it for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you like what I do, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and commenting. If you want to move to the next episode, simply use playlist or hit the icon at the side. And I'm hoping to see you in the next one. See you!